I have had this little sewing gauge in my sewing kit for about 9 or 10 years, but until now had only ever actually used it for measuring up hems. Turns out there's a whole load of other ways you can use these nifty little tools, so let's put it to the test. You probably have one in your sewing kit. This has been in my kit for 9 or 10 years. I think I got this from Merchant and Mills. You can get various different types. Some of them have other bells and whistles, but they're all generally the same. They all have, usually they have inches and centimeters. They're made of metal and they have this little slider in the middle as well. So I decided to put it to the test whilst making a Closet Core Jenna shirt. This shirt has been on my list to sew for well over a year. In fact, there's a video about a year ago where I made a Closet Core Jenna and said that I wanted to make one in this fabric, and it's finally done. Hurrah! So I thought this would be the perfect pattern to sew and put the sewing gauge to the test to see how many ways I could find to use it. Now, this is not an exhaustive list. There are loads of other ways that you could use it that I haven't done for this particular project. So there might have to be another video down the line as well. But here are just some of the ways that I have found to use this tool whilst making the Closet Core Jenna. So let's start with number one. The most obvious is measuring up things like hems, or I have used it here to turn in the edges of the pocket. You can use the little slider to put it exactly where you want it. So on the pocket I had to measure in, I think it was about 1/4 of an inch or 6 millimeters. So I could move the slider in and get that really nice and accurate. So number two, and this one actually really blew my mind because I had never registered this little corner on the end of the sewing gauge here. It's a little triangle of the metal and it's actually used for turning out corners. So I use this for when I was sewing the collar, and I just moved the slider right out of the way and used that little corner to push the edge of the fabric right out and get a nice crispy corner on my collar. Who knew? Now, next up, the sewing gauge has actually been designed with different measurements in mind. So this thin strip of metal here, you've got this gap in the middle. This thin strip here actually measures 1/4 of an inch. So I used this when I was pressing in the edges of the tower placket on the sleeve to draw a guideline, a 1/4 of an inch guideline that I was then going to turn and press in order to prepare it for sewing. Make sure you get your tape measure out first just to double check, because like I said, there are a few different versions of the sewing gauge, so you want to make sure you get the right one. But take your sewing gauge to your tape measure and just figure out what all the different measurements are and you'll be amazed. Number four, and this one's really simple, but I don't think I've ever thought to do this before. You've got a really straight edge here, and that makes a really good ruler. I mean, how did I not think of that before? I use this to mark the cut line on the tower placket on the sleeve. So I just laid the paper pattern piece on top of the fabric piece, placed the ruler up against the cut line that I'd already snipped up in the paper pattern as well, and that just gave me a really solid straight edge to take my marker and draw onto the fabric, a really nice straight line. Next up again is another measurement that is already on the sewing gauge. Now, a really common measurement that we use in dressmaking is 5/8 of an inch or 1.5 centimeters. That is quite often the seam allowance on a lot of garments. If you want to check that your machine, if you maybe haven't got such clear guidelines on the machine itself, you can use this end here. This end is 5/8 of an inch. Again, if you've got one of these, check the different measurements because it might be somewhere different on yours, but that is 5/8 of an inch. So I could just put that on top of the fabric whilst it was going under my machine and just making sure that the needle was running on the left of the sewing gauge and the edge of the fabric was on the right. Again, really, really simple. Now this next one is my favorite because I never noticed that on the slider, the plastic slider, just in these corners, there are two little teeny tiny holes. I had never ever noticed these before, but turns out they're really, really useful for accurately pressing and making bias binding. Now the instructions on the Closet Core Jenna Shirt actually have you turn up the hem, but it's got, you can't quite see it there, it's got a really deep curve in the hem. And having done that on the other two versions that I've made, I found it really tricky. So I decided to finish the hem with bias binding instead. And this was a really handy tool for getting the bias binding accurately pressed. So this is really simple to do. All you do is put your sewing gauge onto your ironing board. You've got your strip of bias binding ready to be pressed in. You can press in the first sort of bit of your bias binding as well. You put a little pin into the hole on the end of the slider. Now I could only put a pin into the hole on the right side of the slider. For some reason, this is quite an old sewing gauge and I couldn't quite get the pin in the hole on the left of the slider. So instead I put a second pin into the middle, just sort of underneath the slider. And now the sewing gauge can move independently from the slider. So you can move the sewing gauge to exactly where you need it to be, put your bias binding underneath, and then you can put another pin in that hole in the top right corner. And that's going to keep your sewing gauge in place. And then you can just gently pull through your bias binding, give it a press, pull it through again and give it another press. And it just makes the pressing in of bias binding so much easier and a lot less likely to burn your little fingertips as well. Now this is another thing I hadn't actually noticed on the sewing gauge or clocked what it was for, but we have these little notches on one long edge of the sewing gauge. The ones on my sewing gauge are marked every inch, but some sewing gauges might be marked every half an inch. And now these are really useful for measuring and marking your buttonhole placement. So I did that on this one. I put on my Jenna shirt and figured out where I wanted the topmost button, which is usually at the fullest point of your bust. And then I took my sewing gauge over to the paper pattern and measured how far apart the suggested button placement was, which in this case was 2 inches. So then I just used those notches and marked every 2 inches down, little dot with my friction pen, and you've got your buttonholes beautifully measured. The final tip that I have for using a sewing gauge is to measure the diameter of your buttons. So this little hole in the middle of your sewing gauge is just about the right thickness for most buttons. So you can just drop your button down into that gap in the middle, move your slider up, and you can see how big your button is. So the button that I have here is about 1.5 centimeters. So if I had a machine that did a 3-step buttonhole function rather than a 1-step buttonhole function, or I needed to know how long I needed my buttonholes to be, now I've got a really accurate measurement of my button, which I can then transfer over onto my pattern. So like I said, this little nifty sewing tool is actually a whole lot more useful than I ever realized. Now, like I said, this list is not exhaustive. I've seen other ways of using it. I've seen it used as a way of marking half circles in order to do like a scalloped edge on a hem. I've seen it used to really accurately mark and measure pin tucks or do tailor's tacks using this little hole here, things like that. So many different ways of using it. There's also lots of ways apparently for knitting, but I haven't delved into using it for knitting, mostly because I don't knit. I am so pleased that I've discovered a whole new way of using this tool, this one tool that I already had in my sewing kit without having to spend money on other tools. And I now have a really beautifully and very accurately sewn shirt, and I'm really, really happy with it. I absolutely love it. Thank you so much everyone for watching. If you have any other suggestions on how to use a sewing gauge that I haven't covered, let me know in the comments below, and perhaps there might be another video in the future as well. Have a fantastic day everyone, and I will see you all soon. Bye.